Well, welcome along to our first discussion in this life group session. We're delighted to have Mark Loughridge with us. He is a pastor from Letterkenny, but we'll get a bit more information about him in a few moments just after we open with a prayer. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for the chance to discuss these issues this evening and to explore worldviews. We thank you that Mark is here with us, and we ask that you would guide our discussions and help us as we explore these topics. May what we say be useful for those listening, and we pray that those listening would find this beneficial in their evangelism and communicating the gospel to others. So we ask this in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
So, Mark, yes, I know you well, being my brother-in-law. You're married to my wife's sister, but just for those watching, can you give us a bit of information about yourself?
Jeremy, thank you. It's great to be here, and thanks for the invitation. Yes, married to Helen's sister Judith, living in Donegal. We've three daughters, Eva, Cara, and Zoe, and I've been minister there and church planting there for the last 20 years or so, I suppose. Maybe a bit more about myself. I know Helen has taken up open water swimming recently as well. I would like to claim all the credit for that, although I think your minister's wife gets the credit for that. I think it's fantastic. I've been at it for a few years as well, and it's how I unwind and relax. It's tremendous. So the more at it, the merrier. I, as well as being the minister in a church, part of my, outreach work is I teach a couple of RE classes in a local school, and I also write a newspaper column for goes into several local papers, because I always want to show people how God's word connects to everyday life, because I believe that the Christian life isn't simply about getting to heaven. If and since the Bible is true, then it's about all of life. It's about all of history from beginning to end, and it shapes how we live and think about absolutely everything. And I suppose I want people who aren't Christians to see that this is the big story into which their lives fit. But I also want Christians to have confidence in the big story as they live. So this is something that I'm really excited you're doing as a church.
Yes, that's something we're looking at this time. It's good that you're here, because you've been exploring this issue of worldview and how important it is for our living that Christians have a grasp of the big story. But first of all, we should probably look at what exactly a worldview is. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, it's a bit of an abstract term, but really, it's just the way we look at the world. It's the story we tell about the world. Our little story of our lives fits inside a bigger story. It doesn't matter who you are, what you believe, we all have a bigger story that our little story fits inside. Who am I? How did I get here? What's gone wrong in the world? Where are we going? What comes next? And the way we answer those questions is going to impact how we live in the world. And so a worldview really is almost like a lens through which we look at the world. For example, in a sense, a very radical example of how we look at the world and how it impacts things. The mass murderer Jeffrey Dahmer said that I was brought up to believe that we were just something like evolved pond scum, and if that's the case, what does it matter what we do? There is no accountability for our actions. So his worldview was that we are nothing and we go to nothing. So what odds? So that's a pretty drastic application of why a worldview matters, but we see that it is practical consequences. And I think why it matters, when you asked the question, what is a worldview? I think one of the ways I think of a worldview is like a tree. It's got leaves, and it's got branches, and it's got a trunk, and it's got roots, and the leaves are the actions that we're engaged in, and very often Christians, we're talking about ethical issues like abortion or transgenderism or homosexuality or redefining marriage. But those are leaves on a tree or fruit on a tree. But those fruit grow on branches, which grow on a trunk, which grow from roots. And for a long time in the West here, the leaves and the fruit were on the Christian tree. But now very much so, the whole support system, the way of thinking, the way of seeing life, the whole story that people believe in has changed. And so as Christians, we need to grasp that, because sometimes when we're saying to people, that action's wrong, that leaf is wrong, that fruit is wrong, you shouldn't be doing that. People hear us and they're looking at us and they're thinking, it's as if we're saying, you should have apples on this tree. But in fact, it's a banana tree. And they're looking and going, why? Why would we have apples on this tree? This isn't consistent with the tree. This isn't consistent with the way we think. And so, as Christians, we're thinking about how people see life and what's the big story of life.
And yes, you mentioned there why it matters that we have these worldviews, because the leaves, in a sense, are just the fruit, the outworking of what the roots are feeding us. And, and that's why it matters to know exactly why we believe what we do, why our Christian worldview matters.
Yeah, and I think it's vital for us. There's a lovely verse in 1 Chronicles that says about the men of Issachar. They knew the times and understood what Israel should do. They had a handle on what was going on. And as Christians, we need to have a handle on what's going on so that we know how to live. So it matters for us for living well-rooted, well-grounded lives, and for our children. They live well-rooted, well-grounded lives in the world which God has placed us. But then also for communication. We live in a world where, in a sense, we need to show people the thought tree that their fruit is growing on. There's in a sense, I suppose, a biblical illiteracy, and they don't know the big story of the Bible. And so sometimes somebody says to me, I don't believe in God. Well, you have a choice at that point. You get into debate on, why they should believe in God or not. But I found it useful to ask, well, what God don't you believe in? Because I mightn't believe in the God they don't believe in either. So there's no point in me trying to defend that God. And I said before them the Bible storyline. But also we live in a world where there's, in a sense, an increasing hostility to the Bible storyline and to Christianity. And yet, the values that people often appreciate in the world are values that grow out of the roots of Christianity. And they are, in a sense, strange fruit on their tree. They don't come out of their tree. So we believe Christianity teaches us that we're all made. The Bible teaches us that we're all made in God's image and that people have meaning and dignity and value. And yet the prevailing thought in the world is that we all got here by a random accident and that we are just, as Jeffrey Dahmer would have put it, we are just pond scum. Well then, but yet people want to be treated with value and dignity. That idea grows on our tree. And so I want Christians to, in a sense, have confidence, but also to be able to show that idea comes from our foundations, and to show how it connects so that people can see that our story is needed.
Yes, indeed. And in fact, that it'd be useful maybe to look at what the building blocks of the Christian worldview are, so that we can relate that to the big story and demonstrate where our roots are and how that works out in the tree.
Yeah, because yes, what we don't want to do is simply pull leaves off the tree. That's no use, because new leaves grow on in their place. And so we want to speak in a way that sets before people the Bible story and challenges the story that they're believing. We need to know our own story first. And I think, you're right, those basic building blocks that the Bible has, we want to, I want people to know that this isn't something new and strange and highfalutin and abstract. The Bible's storyline from Genesis to Revelation is the big story into which our lives fit. And it's a story that goes from creation to fall, to redemption, to restoration. And those building blocks that many Christians are completely familiar with, that's the storyline. And they provide such key truths that are especially needed and especially relevant in the world we're in today.
Yeah, and I think we have a slide of that. Perhaps it would be useful to just go through each of those in turn and look at how that influences the Christian worldview. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, let's take the first component, creation. And in creation, in the opening chapters of Genesis, we're introduced to a God who has made everything. And we're introduced to man, but let's think of man second, God first. The God who has made everything. We're introduced to a God who is personal and relational. Let us make man in our image. So he's talking to someone. And then he speaks to man. He doesn't speak to any of the rest of creation. Why is it that you and I are personal beings? This table isn't personal. You and I are relational. We are brothers-in-law. And, we're married to our wives and their sisters. Human beings are relational. But if we got here by time and chance and accident, how is it that we are A, conscious, B, personal, C, relational? None of that makes sense according to the prevailing scientific story, but it makes full sense. We've got a conscious God who is relational and who's personal. So our story actually has a better explanatory power. It fits the story that we see and feel around us. When we think of God, there's lots of other things we could think of that we're introduced to with God. But let's take man. We're introduced to man as well. And this fantastic account of God saying, let us make man in our image and in our likeness. And this tells us straight from the off that man is made by God and like God. That means that we have dignity and we have value. And those are two things that our world is hungry for. Dignity and value. It tells us that we've got meaning. It tells us that we've got purpose. And as we're talking with people, so often we live in a world where people have the idea that we've reduced people to being human doings. What's your job? How do you do in your exams? And our young people feel constrained to assess themselves on, am I in a relationship? Did I do well in my exams? Have I got a job? What's my sporting achievements? And to reduce ourselves to human doings. But we're told that God made us to know him and that we are human beings first and foremost. And even more in our world, they've reduced our doing to our sexual doings, to our sexuality. And, it's almost like a very narrow tightrope. We reduced what is a human being to what we do. And then we reduced it further to our sexual doings. And people are left walking on this narrow tightrope that wobbles and waves. And there's no security as to who they are in that sense. And they're left, who am I? What's my identity if these things start to change? And yet the Christian worldview is this much safer, much more secure identity. We're a human being made by God, made to know him. And so, an example of how that informs how I relate to people. I was talking to a guy in the street in Letterkenny one day during the abortion referendum. We were out canvassing, and he said, people like you hate people like me. And I said, and who are you? And he said, I'm a gay atheist. And I said, no. Who are you? And he said, my name's Max. I said, well, Max, you may not agree with me, but I believe you're a human being made in the image of God, made by God, and I must treat you with dignity and respect because of who you are. I may disagree with what you do, but you're a human being, and I must treat you this way. And I think it's a helpful truth that comes out of this first building block of creation. I find it interesting that you've got atheists like the great atheist Friedrich Nietzsche and many others who recognize that human rights find their root in the Bible's teaching that we are made in the image of God. And they freely admit that. And so I want Christians to have a confidence in knowing that even that idea is one that they've had to borrow from us. You know?
Very good. And then looking at the next building block, a lot of people feel that there can't be a God if there are so many issues of, so many problems in the world.
Mm-hmm.
The world is broken, they recognize that. But yet, the fall, the next building block, explains the predicament we find ourselves in the world today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's such a necessary building block for understanding the world. Because I think, our people in our world recognize that we are broken actors and we're on a broken stage, but they don't know what to do about the brokenness. So they try to either, in a sense, medicate it away or educate it away. As if we had better education, people wouldn't behave this way. And if people are behaving that way, there must be something wrong with them internally. So let's medicate them. And yes, medication and education have their part. But the Bible teaches us that there's a flaw at the core of our being. We are rebels and we are replacers. We rebel against God and we put good things in the place of God. And those lead to all sorts of conflicts with people when we do that. And they lead to all sorts of ways of expressing ourselves. And so sometimes, when I'm teaching in school, I'll use this building block. The kids they're always trying to trap you, so they'll ask a question. Why does God hate gay people? And they're waiting to see what you say. And one of the ways I've found helpful to respond to that is to say, well, let's step back from that question a minute and ask the question, do you think God has the right to tell us how to live? No, sir. No, he doesn't. I say, well then, your problem isn't actually with sexuality. Your problem is with God. You're asking me about a leaf in the tree. You got a problem with the whole tree. So let's talk about the whole tree. Let's not zoom in on the small detail here. And, because what they're doing is, we're rebels. We will rebel against God. And I think a thing to remember is that this current sort of generation's way of in a sense, sexual redefinition of things is simply this generation's way of rebelling against God. And as Christians, we can very much get hung up on the leaf on the tree and miss the root of the rebellion. And we're busy trying to get people to be nicer rebels or more acceptable rebels to us. No. We want to remember the fall and that we are rebels and replacers, and that's where we need to deal with things.
At least for the Christian then, there is a solution to this fundamental brokenness that we find, rather than looking at, as other worldviews, the secular worldview might try to solve problems by looking at the known world. We have a solution to that in the next building block.
Yeah, well, that, it brings us to redemption, and it's just an amazing part of the story where in real time and real history, we can in a sense even step outside of the Bible and see recorded in history the appearance of Jesus Christ. God steps into history to take on our brokenness on himself and to provide the solution. And that gives us a tremendous message for a world. It shows us that forgiveness and change are possible. It shows us what redemption looks like. It shows us what grace looks like. I find it interesting. I see in the pile of books here, Douglas Murray's book, the madness of crowds. And Murray would describe himself as a gay atheist. And yet he has a chapter in that book on how we need to be forgiving as people. But where does he get that idea from? The idea of forgiveness and its richness comes from our storyline. And it allows us to, people want to be treated with grace and forgiveness. People struggle with guilt and the burdens that it brings. And that sense of, I wish I could relive a moment and undo something. But here we find a God who speaks into that and provides forgiveness for it. So it's what people need in this world.
And the story isn't over either. We have a tremendous hope that in the final building block, all is made new again, and we have the restoration.
It's just tremendous, absolutely tremendous. And what a thing to be able to speak of, that it's not just that God has started something off and that's it. It's that there's something coming that I think human beings have an internal wiring that points us in that direction, an internal compass that directs us that way. We have a longing for things to be better. We have a longing for justice. Maybe something has happened to someone. Maybe something has been done to them. Maybe the circumstances of their life weren't what they wished they were. Maybe they were born with particular disabilities. And I think, I get one shot at life and this was done to me, or this is the way I am. This isn't fair. And they want something better. And yet the Bible storyline is that there is something better coming. And everything will be made new. And everything will be made right. And that sense of injustice that we can have at times when somebody who has committed a terrible wickedness gets away with it. We think that's not fair, that's not right. Everything in us is crying out that there would be justice. The Bible says, yes, there will be perfect justice. And all things will be made new. And we can say to people, a worldview is in a sense putting our little story into a bigger story. And that bigger story, it's got to fit with reality. It's got to fit with who we are, how we're made. It's got to fit with what we see around us. It's got to fit with history. It's got to fit with science. It's got to fit with that. And I believe the Christian worldview does. But in fitting our little story into that bigger story, we're saying to someone, there is hope. It doesn't finish when you die. There's something that comes afterwards. And that there is hope, and all of the brokenness and all of the hurt and all of the pain has meaning and purpose. And as we put our trust in the rescuer, we will find that there's this fourth building block of restoration, everything made new. And so that's what our world needs.
Absolutely. I suppose we'll go on to look perhaps at maybe contrasting worldviews, the secular worldview. But one thing that I found useful was Peter Jones's analogy of the idea of oneness and two-ness, where he talks about essentially two contrasting worldviews. The oneness view where there's nothing but matter. Everything that we can see and feel and experience is our entire reality. But the twoist view where we recognize a creator, where there is another being, as we've talked about the Christian worldview, someone who has created but has also come alongside us in Christ. So I found that useful, and that maybe is a useful way of looking at the secular worldview as compared to the Christian worldview.
Yeah, I think having thought a little bit about how the Bible has a story that fits with reality. I think it's also helpful then to do as you've been thinking about, how are people perceiving the world in which they live? What's going on? What are there tools that we can use that help us get a handle on why people think that way, why people act that way, so that we're not merely looking at the leaves on the top of the tree or the fruit in the tree and going, I don't like that. I don't like that action. I don't like that fruit. I don't like what they're doing. And then we go along and we say, you can sound very sort of whiny. That leaf shouldn't be there, But why is it there? And I think there's a few things, Peter Jones being one of them, that a few writers have found helpful in thinking of how we've got to where we're at in the world. And so, yes, that whole idea of what Peter Jones says, I love it when he says, if you can count to 2, you can be a theologian. So this is great. If you've got the big story, creation, fall, redemption, restoration, you got that in your head and you can count to 2. We're no winner here. Because, and Peter Jones says, that puts you at the very nerve center of culture. Really? Is that all we need? And it's great. Another guy says, that there are only 2 worldviews, the biblical one and the other one. This idea that you've mentioned about 1 and 2, you hear it in John Lennon's song, Imagine. Imagine there's no heaven above us, only sky, man, no hell below us, And he's saying, let's get rid of God. That's a onist view. That's saying there's only creation. Never worry about a creator. It's a bit like what Paul says in Romans 1. They worshipped the creation rather than the creator. And there's so much that's going on in our world that is an expression of that. Whether it's from sort of evolutionary theory that says we don't need a creator, all of this could have generated itself, right through, there's a silencing of God. We don't need him. Right through to the removal of God's fingerprints, I would call them, his fingerprints in us, that he's made us male and female, that he's designed marriage to be between male and female. He's designed marriage between one person and one person. It's not one and many. And yet we're starting to see that being argued for. He's made us male or female. He's given us our gender. And what we're seeing in our world at the minute, and I think it's important for us to remember that sexuality is perhaps just this generation's way of rebelling against God, and or of erasing God from our psyche. We don't want to acknowledge that. So let's get rid of him as creator. Oh, look, there's fingerprints here and there. Quick, erase those fingerprints. We don't want to see those. And I think it's helpful for us to grasp that that's, in a sense, kind of what's going on with all of these issues. And so I think we want to be loud and proud proclaimers of the fact that there's 2. The Bible's way of putting that, and Peter Jones has a lovely section in his book where he says, we want to proclaim that there's 2. We want to proclaim that there is an other, one outside of us. And you think this all sounds a bit technical and all. And the Bible's word for otherness is holiness. I'm like, oh, great, we can do that. I can count to 2 and I can try and be holy. I can try and be godly in my daily life. Oh, wow. Keeping Sunday as God's day, going to church, our church services being, instead of trying to be like the world around us, being other, so that people have a sense of, I don't know what went on, but there was something there, different. I felt a presence. This is what we can do holiness, but holiness isn't some sort of grim-faced legalism. It's a giant advertising, hoarding, a signpost to the world that there is not just creation, there is a creator. And we're saying to the world when we meet on the Lord's Day, there's 2. There's somebody else you need to pay attention to. I just love that as another way of looking at something as simple as God's people going to God's house on God's day and living God's way. It's a very positive way of looking at it.
It's a nice, straightforward way of looking at things, as you say, and bringing the Christian worldview into everything that we do, and trying to make that acknowledge the Creator and
Yes,
everything, I suppose,
yes,
is essentially what it was doing.
And acknowledge his values. You know, if
Values.
you're valuable because you're a human being. Oh, well, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that the secular world is trying to do is, I think, divorce that the values from what we believe are God established facts.
Yes, yes, yes. There's a separation of fact from value, and we think, oh, that sounds very abstract. But you know, I became very much aware of this in the abortion referendum in Ireland, where people from a Christian background were saying, but the child in the womb has a heartbeat. It's a human being. And the other side say, but it's not a person. What? But it's got fingerprints and teeth and brain waves, but it's not a person. You think, well, hold on. And so you maybe just shout a bit louder. It's like being an English person, English speaker in France. You know, they're not understanding, so I will shout louder. But hold on, well, what's actually happening there is we were stating facts. They were responding with value statements. They're not a person. I read a line somewhere where somebody said, they may have biology, but they don't have biography. Oh, right. So we need to, and we see this as well with some of the transgender discussion, where, you know, people even being well-meaning say, look, it's quite simple. You've got male genitalia. You're a man. That's it. And they say, but I don't feel like a man. But this is who you are. This is it. You know. But that's a shouting louder of the fact, and the person is responding with a value. I'm not saying we have to agree with them, but we've got to at least learn that there are different languages being spoken here. And you know, I think it was a guy called Francis Schaeffer said that what has been happening in our world since way back in about the 1800s, there's been this parting of the ways between fact and value. And he described it as if facts were like the ground floor of a house, and then values were the second floor, and values were built on top of facts. But there's been such a parting of the ways that people want to have the values without the facts, so they've sort of got a house built, or a second floor built without the first floor, sort of hanging suspended in midair. And where this, I think, becomes helpful for us to remember is that, you know, we can show people that the values that they actually appreciate come from our facts. So, like the guy in the street that I met who I presume he would like me to treat him with dignity and value because he's a human being, but that comes from him being a human being. That comes from a fact. God has made him his image. And I find this when I'm talking in school, and sometimes they've asked me the question about sexuality and why does God, say no to sexuality? And sometimes I answer it the way I stated a moment ago, and sometimes I'll step back and answer it a different way, and we'll talk about, you know, the Bible refuses to define you as getting your value from one tiny thing you do. God made you to be a much richer being. And I'll talk about, you know, you're more than your exam results. You're more than your looks. You're more than your Instagram likes. You're more than what you achieve. You know, and you can start to see that resonate with the young people. And one of the things, there's a girl asked a question once, and I said to her at the end of class, how did that answer sit with you? Do you think I dodged your question, which I don't want to do? And she said, no. That answered it in a much bigger way than I had ever thought of before. Because everything I was saying about why I would treat, I said, look, I may disagree with you, but I will not see you as a human doing. I will treat you with honor and respect. And it doesn't matter what mess you have got into. You can come for help because you're a human being. You're valuable. And because God has made you. And what I was doing there was trying to connect values back to facts again, show how these two go together, because they belong together. Almost in the sense, what God has joined together, let man not separate.
Yes, yes. And I think a lot of what's happening in secular society is that people are trying to find their happiness. They're finding their value in their feelings. They're finding their expression through that. And that is, as you're saying, that's what they're trying to define themselves as, but it's narrower than the bigger picture worldview that the Christian worldview has.
And it's so, I believe it's so monumentally cruel. And again, this is something that has happened where over the last decades we have, it's like the very air that we breathe. We have been trained to live by our feelings. Several decades ago that Sheryl Crow sang, "If it makes you happy, it can't be that bad." And that's sort of the driving ethos of many pop songs. And every Barbie movie that my daughters have ever watched, and that I've been forced to listen to in long car drives. But, this ethos of our feelings driving us. I think that's something to understand in our world, that feelings have become the primary thing, and particularly even our sexuality as the prime feeling. But even not even going as far as that. I remember reading a newspaper headline, life had lost its sparkle for her. It was about a 50-something-year-old socialite who ended her life because life had lost its sparkle. How tragic. Our sense of happiness had gone, so what's the point in living? And I would want to be saying to people, our feelings are inherently unstable. We know that. That's why we encourage people who are struggling with depression not to rely on their feelings. It's why we go to counselling. It's why we say to people, don't cope with this on your own. Come and talk to somebody. We know that our feelings are unstable. And I want to say to people, there are safer places, safer things to live by than our feelings. And here's a God who steps into time and history, who does not ignore our feelings, who makes these incredible statements of his commitment to us through his Son, Jesus Christ, of a love that is an everlasting love. A God who says, I will rejoice over you with singing, and I have got hope, I've got plans for you so that you can have hope, and I have a future marked out for you. Oh, what a much more secure place to put our hopes in than the reed blowing about in the wind of our feelings. So I want to be speaking to people about that, but because that's where people around us are, in a sense, getting their sense of identity from, I think we need to deal gently with the people we're speaking to, because if somebody has been trained, taught to think that they get their sense of identity from their feelings or their sexual feelings, then our words to them that cause them to question that or that refute that are seen as an attack on the very core of their being. So I want to, at that moment, be saying something to them that shows that they are more. This is not just who they are. But I also want to speak with gentleness and compassion into that, so they can see that although this person is saying something very hard for me to take in, it's undeniable that they care. And I think we need to remember that. We may not like it. We may... people use the phrase Snowflake Generation as a bit of a put-down. I don't think we should do that. I think that it's the air that people have breathed for so long, the whole era of self-esteem and multiplying self-esteem and trophies for everyone, and then the living in a world where everything is rated, and you get likes for this and likes for that, and where perfectionism is required in every area, how you look, the photograph you put up. Why wouldn't there be a fragileness to people? And yet we can say to them, no, you are more than all the likes you could ever have. You are not the sum total of what you do. You are richer than this. And you're not just your sexuality. You're much richer than that. So,
Anything else that you would maybe want to say to Christians listening about maybe just having confidence in the big story, or how they would relate this to unbelievers?
Yeah. Well, I think in part, well, there's a great book here, being the bad guys, and he has a fantastic line in it. Be the best bad guys you can possibly be. Christians are now seen as the bad guys, but so we should be the best bad guys. And by that he goes on to unpack, live joy-filled, compassionate, servant-hearted, godly lives, so that people are, even though they may not like what we say or what we believe, they are drawn, they are intrigued by our lives. And that comes out of knowing the big story and having a confidence in the big story, the direction it's going, so that we're not, we should be such a people that are filled with a hope that comes from knowing that all things are working together for good, and that there's the restoration at the end of it all, that we are filled with such a hope that people come and say, could you tell me why you've got hope? Which is what Peter envisaged in the first century. Set apart Christ as Lord in your heart, so people ask you to give a reason for the hope that is within you. So live, be the best bad guys you can be, and live with confidence in God's big story. Knowing that you know who you are, you know that your deepest problem has been solved, and you know where you're going. You know that you're loved, you know you're secure, you know you've got hope. And as we live that way, people will start to see it, and they'll start to ask about it. That's what our world needs, because in a world where the foundations are being pulled out, when things are becoming increasingly unstable, this will enable us to be like an oak tree that people could go and find shelter under in a storm. And that's what I want us to be like.
Excellent. That's a good place to end there. Thank you so much for chatting to me. We could have
Pleasure.
chatted for ages, I'm sure, but thank you so much for being here. That's been very useful. Thank you.